There's a moment in sports that rarely gets discussed. Not the dramatic winning shot, not the triumphant trophy lift, not the polished smile in the press conference. It's the moment that comes before all of that. When the spotlight is off, when the cameras have stopped rolling, when an athlete believes they are utterly alone, and yet they still decide to be precisely who they are. That is the moment this story is truly about. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end of it, you're going to feel something today that you didn't expect to feel. So stay with me. Rome, Italy, May 2026. The Foro Italico, one of the most legendary tennis venues in the world, where the clay glows red like terracotta and the late spring air hangs heavy with decades of history. The main draw of the Italian Open is still days away from beginning. The biggest matches remain distant. Most of the top players are using these calm morning hours to practice quietly, to rest, or to prepare in private. And that is exactly what Eala was supposed to be doing. She had just wrapped up a morning training session on one of the outer courts. Her coaching team was busy packing up the equipment behind her. She had a challenging first-round match scheduled for the next day, and her mind should have been completely focused and locked in. But then she noticed them near the players' exit, a small group, perhaps a dozen people at most. They were holding Philippine flags, some carried handmade signs, and they had been standing there for hours. Not because they were guaranteed to see anyone special, not because anyone had promised them special access, but simply because hope is a powerful enough reason to stand in the Roman heat and wait. Most players would have kept walking right past them. I want you to truly understand that because it matters. These were not courtside ticket holders, these were not sponsors, these were not journalists. They were simply ordinary people who loved her, and the security team was already beginning to move in their direction. She stopped, she turned around, and then she did something that nobody in that courtyard was prepared for. She reached into her tennis bag. Now here is where I need you to slow down with me because what happened next unfolded in layers and each layer landed differently. The fans leaned forward in anticipation. What was she reaching for? A marker for autographs, her phone for a quick selfie, and then she pulled out a stack of shirts, not generic tournament merchandise, not sponsor-provided gear. These were shirts from her own personal clothing line, carrying her own logo, something she had personally designed and built as a way to stay connected with the people who believed in her. She hadn't planned this. Nobody had asked her to do it. There was no camera crew present. There was no social media manager standing nearby with a ring light. It was simply Eala, a bag full of shirts, and a group of people who had traveled far from home to stand in the sun and hope for even a single moment. The first shirt went to a little girl, maybe 10 years old, standing in the front with a Philippine flag tied around her shoulders like a cape. Eala crouched down to her level, held out the shirt, and said, "Para sa iyo." The girl looked down at the shirt, then back up at Eala, and completely fell apart in the most beautiful way. Tears flowed. Her mother, standing right beside her, was already crying even before the girl started, and the crowd around them fell silent, watching and feeling it, because some moments are simply too big for noise. But then she did something that I think really broke everyone there. She didn't turn back to the easier fans who were closer to her. Instead, she looked through the crowd and spotted someone at the very back, an elderly woman leaning on a cane, her flag still raised high even though her arms were shaking from holding it for so long. Eala walked toward her, moving past everyone else, and stood directly in front of her. "You've been standing here all day," she said. "You should have this." What happened next is difficult to describe without sounding like I'm dramatizing it, but I'm not. The woman accepted the shirt with trembling hands and pressed it to her face. She just stood there, pressing it to her face and breathing it in, and then she looked up at Eala and whispered, "Salamat, anak. Thank you, child." And Eala, this 22-year-old tennis player who was supposed to be preparing for an important match, pulled that woman into a full embrace. Not a quick one, not the polite kind. She held on, and the people standing around them weren't cheering. They were simply watching in quiet reverence. Some were crying, some were covering their mouths because it wasn't about the shirts anymore. It never really was. Now here is the part of this story that transformed it from a beautiful moment into something the entire tennis world couldn't stop talking about. 50 feet away, standing in the shadow of one of the stadium's side corridors, dressed casually and deliberately keeping a low profile, was Roger Federer. He had slipped out of the venue through a side entrance, specifically trying to avoid the crowds, the cameras, and the constant pull of being recognized. He wasn't there to be seen. He was actively trying not to be seen. But something made him stop. And for the entire duration of what Eala was doing, every shirt, every hug, every whispered word, Federer stood completely still and watched. He didn't wave, he didn't approach, he didn't pull out his phone, he just watched. And at some point, almost to himself, he said 4 words, "She gets it." A tournament official standing nearby caught it just barely. "She gets it." that's all, and when asked what he meant, Federer didn't elaborate, he simply kept watching, and then quietly he turned and walked away. I've been following tennis for a long time. I've seen players be kind, I've seen players be generous, I've seen athletes do great things for cameras, for causes, and for the public eye. But here's what makes this specific moment different and why I think it spread the way it did. The security footage leaked before anyone even knew Federer had been there. The original clip that went viral was just Eala handing out shirts, hugging that elderly woman, crouching down to the little girl. That alone was enough to move people. That alone would have been the story. But then someone noticed the figure in the background, partially obscured, standing very still. The internet collectively zoomed in, adjusted the brightness, argued about it for about 40 minutes and then confirmed it. Roger Federer, 20 Grand Slam titles, arguably the greatest player to ever hold a racket, standing in the shadows, watching, completely unannounced and unnoticed until he was. The clip restarted, people rewatched it specifically to study his expression, and what they saw wasn't just passive observation. There was something on his face that people kept describing the same way: wonder. Not exactly pride, though it carried traces of that. Not exactly surprise, though he hadn't expected to see it. Wonder, like he was watching something he recognized from somewhere deep inside himself. Something he thought you had to earn through decades of experience before you could fully understand it. And here is the thing about Roger Federer that I think gets lost amid the trophies, the records, and the perfect backhand. He has said in interviews over the years that the most important shift in his career wasn't technical, it wasn't tactical, it was internal. He has talked about how when you're young on tour, almost everything is about receiving, coaching, attention, opportunity. It all flows toward you and you absorb it because you have to. But at some point, if you're paying attention, the current changes direction. And the players who figure that out early, the ones who start giving before the world tells them they've earned the right to, those are the ones who last. Not just in terms of career length, but in terms of meaning, in terms of what they leave behind. Eala figured that out at 22, and Federer watched it happen from 50 feet away and recognized it immediately because he remembers what it took him to learn it. This is where the story gets bigger than one morning in Rome. Eala's path to this moment is not what you'd call conventional. In 2018, at 13 years old, she was awarded a scholarship to train at the Rafa Natal Academy in Mallorca, Spain. She arrived with a suitcase and a dream, and by most accounts not a great deal else. No connections, no safety net, just talent and the willingness to work harder than the people around her. The academy gave her everything: world-class facilities, elite coaching, a philosophy about the game that went far beyond technique. And Natal's philosophy, for those who have followed his career closely, has never been just about winning. It has always been about people, about surrounding yourself with the right ones, about treating the game as a privilege rather than a right, about understanding that whatever platform you're given is borrowed, and the interest you owe on it is paid in how you treat others. Eala absorbed all of it, and then she went out into the world and started building a career that, by the raw numbers, looks modest. Just over $1 million in career prize money, an endorsement portfolio that's growing but nowhere near the top tier, a ranking that's still climbing. But here is what the numbers don't show. She launched her own clothing line not for the income but as a direct line to her fans. She designed the logo herself, she thought carefully about what the brand should represent, and then she packed some of those shirts in her tennis bag before a tournament in Rome, not because a manager told her to do a fan activation, not because a sponsor required community engagement as a contract deliverable, but because some quiet part of her thought, if I see someone who needs to feel seen today, I want to be ready. She was ready and she didn't hesitate. I keep coming back to that detail because I think it's the one that separates intention from character. Intention is deciding in advance to do something good. Character is doing it anyway when the moment is unexpected, inconvenient, and completely unscripted. Eala didn't plan the fans, she didn't plan the timing, she didn't plan Federer standing 50 feet away. She just looked at a group of people who had given their whole day to stand in the heat and hope for a single moment, and she gave them more than they came for. After the video passed 15 million views, after the comments flooded in from across the world, from Filipino fans calling it historic, from tennis journalists calling it significant, from casual viewers who had never followed tennis a day in their lives but found themselves unexpectedly moved by 2 minutes of grainy security footage, after all of that, Federer still said nothing publicly. No social media post, no formal statement, no interview comment, just silence. And in the strange, specific language of tennis culture, where what someone chooses not to say often carries more weight than what they do, that silence read like a standing ovation. Because Federer doesn't validate casually. He doesn't show up in places he doesn't mean to show up. He doesn't stand in shadows watching strangers unless something pulls him there. Something pulled him there, and that something is impossible to fully name, but it feels like recognition. the recognition of a person who really understands what this life is for. There's a line Federer said once in a quieter interview that I think about a lot. He said, "The trophies fade, the relationships last forever." He said it almost offhandedly, the way people say the truest things as if they're slightly embarrassed by how much they mean it. Eala is 22 years old and she already knows that, not because someone told her, not because it was in a manual somewhere, but because she showed up at 13 with nothing and people chose to believe in her anyway. And she felt what that felt like, and she never let herself forget it. The young girl with the flag cape will forget what the shirt feels like in her hands, but she will never forget the moment that a woman she had admired from a distance crouched down, looked her in the eyes and said, "This is for you." The elderly woman with the cane will someday not remember every detail of that Roman morning, but she will remember being walked toward instead of past. She will remember being seen when she expected to be invisible. And Roger Federer, who has witnessed more great tennis than nearly any human being alive, who has played on the grandest stages the sport has ever known, who has shaken hands with presidents and held trophies in cathedrals. He will remember a courtyard in Rome where a young woman quietly did something that nobody required of her and did it anyway, and didn't look around to see who was watching. He was watching, and he smiled like a man who had just been reminded why the whole thing matters. Here is what I want to leave you with because I think it's the question that outlasts the clip and the comments and the 15 million views. What is a legacy really? Is it a ranking, a title count, a highlight reel? Or is it the accumulation of small, private, unrequired choices, the ones where nobody's holding you accountable except yourself, that eventually add up to the kind of person you become? Eala is still building hers. She has matches left to win, surfaces left to conquer, rounds left to fight through. Her story is nowhere near finished. But somewhere in Rome, in the quiet after the fans dispersed and the flags were folded away, she stood alone for a moment with a lighter bag. And she smiled, not for the camera. Not for the brand, not for the moment that would eventually be seen by millions. She smiled because she had given something away and felt richer for it. And 50 feet away, a man who took 20 years and 20 grand slams to fully understand that truth had just watched a 22-year-old already live it. She gets it, 2 words, barely a whisper, the loudest thing Federer said all year.